Oh, well, that's Dennis's job, so. We are in Isaiah chapter 34 tonight, and I suppose it would probably be good in light of the recent quarter change to kind of briefly go over some of where we're at right now. Basically, at this point, from chapter 28 onwards, really, Isaiah has been talking about the problem, the crisis that Israel is facing. If you were to, well, really, the southern kingdom of Judah at this point, if you had asked anybody in Judah, what's the big issue facing us today? And the question would inevitably be, how are we going to deal with the Assyrian crisis? And the answer they saw was simple. Let's make an alliance with Egypt so that we can protect ourselves. But Isaiah comes into the picture and says, no, not only have you completely come up with the wrong solution, you've completely misidentified the problem. The real problem, as he puts it in chapters 28 and 29, is that these leaders of Judah are so spiritually bankrupt that they have become blind, like a drunken man. They're in a complete stupor. They're not listening to what God has said. Their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote. And so the trusting in Egypt isn't going to solve any of their problems, really. Egypt is just a Rahab who rests, a dragon do-nothing, we learned from chapters 30 and 31. And the true solution that God presents is Himself as the leader of Israel, as the king. So we have this choice now that is placed before Israel. Are we going to serve God, or are we going to trust in the nations instead to save us? And that brings us to chapters 34 and 35, which really kind of go together, and they're paired together. And I want to try to cover both of them tonight. Chapter 34 describes this desolation that takes place, and it's what's going to happen if they trust the nations. Chapter 35 depicts a beautiful garden. That's what's going to take place if they trust God instead. The chapters are a diametrically opposed contrast, part of the Bible's tension between life and death, blessing and curse, heaven and hell. It's like all the way back to Deuteronomy 30 in verse 19 and 20, where he says, I set before you today life and death, the blessing and the curse, so choose life that you may live. Well, here, when he lays it out like this, it's the simple choice that the people face. It's the choice that we face every day. Let's begin reading in chapter 34. Look more at the negative side of things to start with. Draw near, O nations, to hear, and listen, O peoples. Let the earth and all it contains hear, and the world and all that springs from it. For the Lord's indignation is against the nations, and His wrath against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to slaughter. So their slain will be thrown out, and their corpses will give off their stench. And the mountains will be drenched with their blood, and all the host of heaven will wear away. The sky will be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts will also wither away, as a leaf withers from the vine, or as one withers from the fig tree. For my sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom, and upon the people whom I have devoted to destruction. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is sated with fat, and the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Wild oxen will also fall with them, and young bulls with strong ones. Thus their land will be soaked with blood, and their dust become greasy with fat. For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Its streams will be turned into pitch, and its loose earth into brimstone, and its land will become burning pitch. It will not be quenched day or night. Its smoke will go up forever. From generation to generation it will be desolate. None will pass through it forever and ever. But pelican and hedgehog will possess it, and owl and raven will dwell in it. And he will stretch over it the line of desolation and the plumb line of emptiness. Its nobles, there is no one there whom they may proclaim king. And all its princes will be nothing. Thorns will come up in its fortified towers, nettles and thistles in its fortified cities. It will also be a haunt of jackals and an abode of ostriches. The desert creatures will meet there with the wolves. The hairy goat also will cry to its kind. Yes, the night monster will settle there and will find herself a resting place. The tree snake will make its nest and lay eggs there, and it will hatch and gather them under its protection. Yes, the hawks will be gathered there, every one with its kind. Seek from the book of the Lord and read. Not one of these will be missing. None will lack its mate. For his mouth has commanded, and his spirit has gathered them. He has cast the lot for them, and his hand has divided it to them by line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation they will dwell in it. This sounds like a great place to buy your summer home, right? All these terrifying things that happen here. And really what you got is the first 4 verses are more talking about the general devastation of God's wrath against the nations. And verses 5 through 8 kind of zero in a little bit on Edom. Edom is singled out as a kind of exhibit A of all the nations. And then verses 9 through 17, again, kind of expand the picture to describe this just total, worldwide devastation. What kind of images does Isaiah use, particularly in the first 4 verses, to describe what's going on here? The end of the world. It sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? Don, what do you have?
Pretty much. All
yeah.
you do is start it over again. The Lord's indignation
Yeah.
that's not a good thing.
Yeah, that's right. Jenna.
I don't remember where the song was but they kind of portray it as a good thing.
Yeah.
And verse 4 is
Yeah, the song "It Is Well With My Soul" has a line, when the Lord hates the day when faith shall be sight, the clouds roll back as a scroll. Now, it's either alluding to this passage or it's alluding to where it's quoted in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 14. But in both cases, the image is very similar. It's a depiction of judgment and terror. Now, ultimately, the judgment of God comes in hand with the salvation of His people. You can't separate the two. And so, I think there is a cause for, rejoicing at that. But this idea of the sky being rolled up like a scroll, when do you roll up a scroll? When you're finished with it, right? I'm done with this. Rolls it up, puts it away. The sky will be rolled up like a scroll, but look at the line before it. The host of heaven will wear away. All their hosts will wither away as a leaf withers from the vine. It's like God takes the whole sky and just wraps it up and puts it away. It's gone now. It's like, it really does sound like the end of the world, doesn't it? Utter destruction in verse 2. He uses this word for utterly destroyed. We've seen this word a bunch of times in the Bible to describe the ban or the devotion to destruction, the Canaanite genocides, cherem, which here God's plan is to utterly destroy all nations, not just the Canaanites. The mountains are drenched from blood. That's a really gory image. Imagine that the soil has become so saturated, but it's not saturated with water, it's saturated with blood. Jenna?
So it's the idea that they're throwing out their dead people and it becomes so high that it's taller than a mountain and the mountain gets
There's a couple different ways to interpret it. Another theory, which it might be less likely, but here's a thought, is that the mountains are actually melted from the blood. And you get this image almost of there's so much blood that it has actually eroded the mountains. I don't know, that might be pressing it a little too far, but that's a possible way to translate it. Again. In any case, it's not a happy picture. It's really quite gory. But it's not as gory as what comes next. Oh, do you have something else? No, go ahead. No.
I was thinking, I just saw at the end of verse 4 as
Well, yeah, there's this picture, throughout the Bible, again, of, the righteous man. He's like a tree that does not wither in its season. Well, the unrighteous man, by implication, does wither in his season. He doesn't receive provision from God. I was looking at Isaiah 40 today, actually, and it's that same kind of, this picture of the frailty of man. Man is like the grass. His glory is like the flower of the grass. And flowers and grass are, well, they don't last very long. And if they last too long, they get cut by the lawnmower today. But, the idea here is that, man is insignificant, but the Word of God endures forever. Here you have kind of a similar image, but here it's just describing, how the whole world is just frail before God. He made it, and He can eliminate it from existence just like that. Verses 5 through 8, Edom's judgment could say that, for my sword is satiated, or when my sword is satiated. Literally, his sword is drunk in heaven. It's like the sword is drinking blood, and it's just had too much. Why single out Edom, though? Why pick on Edom here? Satisfied is one way to translate it, and drunk is another way to translate it. It's again a translation issue. Hebrew is a funny language because it's the word for satisfied can also mean overfilled or oversatisfied at the same time. It just kind of depends. A couple different ways to take it. But why Edom? Why is Edom singled out? You think it's symbolic? Okay. Well, what is Edom a symbol for? Okay, enemies of God. They've always been a warring nation. Good. Esau. Well, what kind of a person was Esau? Yeah, I know. Well, does the Bible say that was a good thing? No. Hebrews 12 calls him an immoral and godless person. That's not a very pleasant epitaph. But yeah, all those things are true of Edom. Another thing that comes into the picture is pride. In Obadiah, for instance, Edom is, we live in the clefts of the rock. We can, we're unassailable. And no, you're not. Jenna. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. I gotta might work that into the next one. Yeah, okay. Well, actually, the name Edom means red, doesn't it? That's why he's called Edom, is because I want some of that red stuff there. Edom. So there might be something to that. Then the word for blood is also dam, so there might be a word play going on even there. Gail, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just thinking that also the anti-Israel.
Yes.
Versus Jacob, it's Edom versus Israel.
Like Malachi 1, 2, and 3, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. Edom is very much the anti-Israel. It's pretty much, it becomes a symbol of the world, or a symbol of the nations.
Everything that's not.
Yeah, everything that is not what God's people. There's a similar past, yes? No?
Did God say those two would ever be in peace?
That's an interesting question. God told them to... He commanded them that they weren't supposed to pick fights with each other. In Obadiah, he indicts Edom for basically rejoicing in the day of Israel's defeat, and even trying to cut off some of the captives from escaping. So there's definitely this command of get along with each other, guys, when they don't do it. But then you go back to Ishmael and Edom and... Yeah, you do have... In Genesis 26, there is a comment about when Isaac is blessing Jacob, and then he quote-unquote blesses Esau. The last thing he says to Esau is that, chapter 27, excuse me, I'm in the wrong chapter. Behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of heaven above. By your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. But it shall come about when you become reckless that you will break his yoke from your neck. Genesis 27, verses 39 and 40. So that's kind of the relationship between Israel and Edom spelled out there in a little blessing, which I hadn't even thought to look at that text before coming here, but even the language of the sword kind of ties into Isaiah a little bit. Just as Edom lived by the sword, now the sword of the Lord has been awakened against Edom. And yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't think the Israelites.
Well, we'll get to the sacrifice. I want to get to the sacrifice in a minute, but yeah, there is a sacrificial language being used here. Jenna, did you have something? You were going to talk about the sword?
You already said it.
Oh, okay. I already made your comment. Okay. All right. Yeah, Edom is the antithesis of Israel. Edom is depicted as a giant animal sacrifice. And, you kind of... see, the thing about sacrifice in the Bible is that, God, He commanded sacrifice from people. He commanded all these different offerings, burnt offerings, sin offerings, and so on. But the ultimate sacrifice is culminated in Jesus. Now, sacrifice is depicted in another way in Scripture as well. The prophets would sometimes use it as a symbol for judgment. And several passages to go to. Jeremiah 46, Ezekiel 39, Zephaniah 1, 7 through 8. That's one of the ones I like to go to. In Zephaniah 1 and verses 7 through 8, it says that, be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is near. For the Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated His guests. Then it will come about on the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes, the king's sons, and all who clothe themselves with foreign garments. When you think about it for a second, what was the purpose of a sacrifice? To pay homage to God. Why? To atone, forgiveness for sins, right? And there's a sense in which the animal kind of takes the punishment that you deserve for yourself. There's a, yes, Jen? Yes, there's an element of worship in there, certainly. But there's also an element of atoning in there, and that's where I'm going with this. That, without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness of sins. So, if animal sacrifices are going to atone for the sins of the people, well, what about these nations here? They don't offer an animal sacrifice. They themselves become the sacrifice for their own sins. They receive the penalty that the animal sacrifices get. They kind of cut out the middleman, so to speak.
Right. But when we offer sacrifices,
Yeah.
apparently when God has to make His own sacrifice,
No, it does not.
Zephaniah, when He is making the sacrifice, yeah,
Jenna.
getting
Jenna.
How much is the ram for Abraham?
Well, yeah, God provides the ram for Isaac. There's an example of that. But, even then, God provides... Well, there's a whole host of things we could get into in talking about sacrifice and really, really get off the outline. But the picture here is this idea of sacrifice as a symbol of judgment. God has... His sword, in verse 6, is filled with blood and sated with fat. Those were the two elements that Levitical offerings were all about. You read Leviticus 3, all fat is the Lord's. And all the blood, you don't eat blood because the life is in the blood, and the blood also is an element that gets sacrificed. So here, these elements of fat and sacrifice, and it gets really graphic again because the land in verse 7 is soaked in blood and greasy with fat. And until somebody else becomes the sacrifice for sin, we're all doomed to become this. Now, Isaiah also talks about, when we get to Isaiah 52 and 53, and we see the suffering servant, and we see the language of how He Himself bore our iniquities, we see that, this is what He becomes. He pours Himself out as a guilt offering. But that's in the future, so, and as far as our study is concerned anyway, so, spoiler alert. What'd you say? What'd you say? Oh no. That's a really terrifying judgment. Fast food kitchens. Okay, Okay, moving on. Verse 8, the Lord has a day of vengeance and a year of recompense. Vengeance is ultimately God's prerogative. Deuteronomy 32 says that vengeance is mine, I will repay. The day of vengeance, though, is also a day of redemption for Mount Zion. It's interesting, Jesus uses the same expression in Luke 21:22 to talk about judgment on Jerusalem. He talks about the day of vengeance that God has brought against the people. Because the Jews reject God's Messiah, God rejects them and by destroying the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. That's one little interesting tidbit to throw in there. Any comments or questions up through verse 8? Verse 9, verses 9 through 17, who is being addressed from verse 9 onward? Are we still talking just to Edom? Huh? Yeah. Well, actually, we never was he only just talking to Edom at any point? There's probably a better question. Don. Right.
To hear and listen.
You kind of have this like little prophetic shift you'll see sometimes, where the prophet will be talking to a specific nation, but then he'll immediately broaden the scope. What I just said applies to everybody, not just you. For example, in Obadiah is this oracle against Edom. It's the shortest book in the Old Testament. And he goes on for a little bit about all the things that Edom has done wrong. And then in verse 15 he shifts and says, the day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. As you've done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. He kind of did that with the Babylon oracle back in Isaiah 13. If you remember, he was talking about Babylon, but then he said that, thus I will punish the world for its iniquity. I think that was in Isaiah 13 and verse 10 that said that. So there we have this destruction taking place. Verse 10 talks about fire and verses 9 and 10 talk about fire and brimstone. What does fire and brimstone remind us of? Sodom and Gomorrah. Yep, first place in the Bible we see that. It's also the image that's later used in Revelation, the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. Verses 10 and 11. I like this little comparison in verses 10 through 11 because it says something about how people that interpret the Bible too literally, especially in poetic, prophetic passages. You've got, it'll not be quenched day or night. Its smoke will go up forever and ever from generation to generation. It will be desolate. None will pass through it forever and ever. But pelican and hedgehog will possess it. Now, and owl and raven will dwell in it. So, can we interpret that literally? Well, why not? Don?
None will pass through it forever.
They're made out of asbestos is what they are. They're fireproof pelicans and hedgehogs is what we've got. This says something. You got to be careful when interpreting passages like this in Isaiah. It's some people that want to press the language too hard, or they want to cherry pick a little passage and say, we're going to apply this super literally, without really paying attention to the context. And you've got both elements in there. This total destruction of fire, and then all these wild, unclean animals. They're both, it's a mixed metaphor. It's intended to convey something of an idea of desolation and destruction. It's like Isaiah's pulling everything in the vocabulary of total devastation to show how bad this situation really is. So we have desolation and emptiness, tohu and bohu in verse 11. Those are the same words that are used in Genesis 1:2 actually, when it says that the earth is formless and void. It is desolation and emptiness, a decreated world. No one is proclaimed as king in verse 12. Well, if you don't have God as king, who are you going to have as king? It raises the question. Yes, the hedgehogs will be your king. Hedgehog administration. Verse 13, more unclean animals, jackals, ostriches. Verse 14, we have the hairy goat, which can also be translated satyr or goat demon. It's the word used in Leviticus 17:7 of goat demons. And also we have the night monster, or does anybody's version have something other than night monster? Owl, screech owl. Some of the older versions have screech owl. Huh? Verse 14, sorry. Verse 14, the hairy goat will also cry to its kind. Yes, the night monster will settle there. The word there is Lilith, which became the basis for all of the strange Jewish myths about the demon woman Lilith that... I'm kind of disappointed Mark's not here, because he and I are always joking about Lilith in the Bible and all the crazy theories that people have created on top of it. If you read the Moffat translation, they have vampires there actually, which is kind of funny. Didn't know there were vampires in the Bible. Jenna?
We're not naming any of our kids.
I wasn't saying that. I wasn't arguing for that at all.
It makes sense when they
Most versions interpret it to be some kind of nocturnal animal, but Lilith was a demonic figure from the Babylonian Talmud, and over the millennia she gets kind of an elaborate backstory. There's one version of it that makes her Adam's first wife, and she's married to an archangel in one version. It's very, very strange. I'm not so fond of that kind of speculation. I'll just kind of leave it as is. It's not a happy picture. Again, Jenna.
kind of like what we did with Bloody Mary.
I'm going to pass over that and not risk betraying my total cultural ignorance.
Okay, now I know what you're
Okay. Well, Revelation 18 and verse 2 talks about Babylon. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. So there is that. There is precedence elsewhere in the Bible for seeing this as kind of demonic imagery. Whether you interpret it to be just more animals or demons is up to you. I'm undecided on how I would view it. And finally, verses 16 and 17, the book of the Lord. The book of the Lord indicates God's knowledge of His people. Not one of the people in God's book will be missing. We might call it the book of life later on. And really verses 16 and 17 are more of a transition. Because on the one hand, these wild animals are going to inhabit the land forever, verse 17. But on the other hand, you can also interpret it positively to go with what comes after. My people are going to inhabit this garden I'm about to describe forever as well. So the Spirit is gathering them. God casts a lot to set boundaries. The nations don't decide their own territory, but rather Yahweh decides it for them. I realize I covered a lot of things really quick there and glossed over some things. Are there any comments or questions up to the end of chapter 34? Let's end it on a more positive note. Chapter 35, the wilderness and the desert will be glad, and the Arabah will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will blossom profusely and rejoice with rejoicing and the shout of joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it. The majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Encourage the exhausted and strengthen the feeble. Say to those with anxious heart, take courage, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. The recompense of God will come, but He will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah. The scorched land will become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals, its resting place, grass becomes reeds and rushes. A highway will be there, a roadway, and it will be called the highway of holiness. The unclean will not travel on it, but it will be for him who walks that way. And fools will not wander on it, no lion will be there, nor will any vicious beast go up on it. These will not be found there, but the redeemed will walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord will return and come with joyful shouting to Zion, with everlasting joy upon their heads. They will find gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Okay, so this is a more happy picture. You have a blossoming garden that comes as a result of trusting God. Now, when was this fulfilled? Huh? End of time? Okay.
When Jesus came, that's why
When Jesus came?
Jesus came and asked, who are you? John wants to know who you are. He says, go tell them. The blind and walk.
Okay.
And the poor have a
And the poor have the gospel preached to them. Quote from Isaiah 61. Don? Right. Yeah. Now, this is an example of a prophecy with probably more than one fulfillment. It's fulfilled in the return from captivity a little bit. And then in the ministry of Jesus, you have blind eyes opened, which, in John 9, we've never heard of this kind of thing happening before since the beginning of time, that somebody who was blind had their eyes open. But Jesus did that. The lame will leap like a deer. You have that kind of same thing going on when the Spirit is poured out in Pentecost too. But there's a time coming when this will be fulfilled in a more full sense, and we will dwell in the garden of the Lord permanently, and that does come at the end of time. So there's a lot of prophecies that do find their absolute fullest fulfillment at the end. But God has a way of sort of, causing a recapitulating outward spiral approach to the fulfillment of prophecy, if you will. The desert of chapter 34 blossoms. The blossoming desert is a result of the outpouring of the Spirit. Remember back in chapter 30, chapter 32, when the Spirit was poured out from on high and the wilderness becomes a fertile field, and the fertile field is considered as a forest. Whenever God's Spirit is poured out, it takes what is desolate and worthless and turns it into something glorious instead. There's a call to strengthen the weak in verse 3. Encourage the exhausted and strengthen the feeble. That's kind of half quoted, half alluded to by the Hebrew author in Hebrews chapter 12 in verses 12 and 13. In Hebrews 12 and verses 12 and 13, therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight paths for your feet, so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Pursue peace with all men and the sanctification, without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. That there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal. For you know that even afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, who found no place for repentance, though he sought for it with tears. So there, the Hebrew author kind of makes both contrasts. He talks about how, you need to be doing this. You need to be strengthening the weak and helping the feeble, or you're going to wind up like Esau, Edom. Gail. Oh, yeah, we were getting to that, but yes. Yeah, there's another good connection to see. The Hebrew author really, really, really likes to fuse all these Old Testament ideas together, and there's another instance of that. And of course, what we get here, in verses 5 through 7, we just have this picture of total reversal. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame leap, the mute shout. It's backwards of what you saw in Isaiah 6, where he said, blind yourselves, be blind. Keep looking, but do not see. Keep hearing, but do not understand. Render the hearts of the people dull. He talks about how, but here, all that stuff is reversed again. The blind see. God can do these things. Jesus fulfills these things in His miracles. We've already pointed out that it's quoted there in Luke 7:22. The image of the lame leaping might call to mind that guy in the temple in Acts 3 in verse 8. He was walking and leaping and praising God. There's this abundance of water that comes out as well, which waters break forth in the wilderness. You don't normally find water in the desert. This is a place where you do find water because God has taken what was desolate and made it whole again. The springs of water in a thirsty land. That kind of sounds like Israel in the wilderness. Wandering around, water comes out of the rocks for them. The last place in the world you'd expect to find water. And it comes out of the rocks and provides them with something to drink. The haunt of jackals is converted into a resting place. So all sorts of good things. And then we have this highway of holiness in verses 8 through 10. What is the highway of holiness? Okay, a way that is set apart for believers. Don? I hadn't thought of that connection, but yeah, that's probably something to think about as well. You know, that there's a right path and a wrong path. Jenna?
Is it the way out of the wilderness?
Is it what?
Is it the way either out of the wilderness or the way to the water?
It's a good question. Isaiah talks about the highway quite a bit. And we're going to see more of this when we get to chapter 40 especially. Whenever there's a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord in the wilderness. It's kind of, all the mountains and the valleys are being moved out of the way to create a straight path for God to get to His people. And, when John the Baptist is in the wilderness crying out, he's preparing the way for the Lord so that Jesus can come. Okay, I saw Gail and then Wayne. Yeah. Good. I'm sorry?
What were the Israelites chosen?
Well, ultimately they were chosen to bring the Messiah into the world. Yeah, okay, so there's this picture, of bringing the Christ into the world. I think that's probably part of it.
Trying to keep so they don't end up with a bunch of
Yeah. Elsewhere in Isaiah, you also see the highway is used kind of as a way of God gathering the nations together. Like in Isaiah 19, for instance, there's a highway from Egypt and Assyria, and they all converge, all roads converge at Jerusalem. Now, is that literally happening? No. The point is that, it's that picture you had in Isaiah 2, where all the nations flow to the mountain of the house of the Lord. All the Gentile nations even follow this highway to get to God. And, they get to God and they become part of His people. And unlike chapter 34, where it was just an infestation of wild animals everywhere, there's no wild animals on this highway. There's no lions. You think of, how many times in the Bible is somebody traveling down a highway and they get attacked by a lion and killed? Or in Samson's case, he gets attacked by a lion and kills the lion. But I don't know how you tear something as a man tears a young goat. Like, that's easy. But it's that kind of image. You don't have to worry about that. You don't have to travel in fear anymore. It's a safe way, ultimately. It's a way that not many people choose because it's the narrow way, but it is the safe way ultimately because you don't have to worry about getting mauled by lions or destroyed by any vicious beasts. Jenna, do you have something? Oh yeah, 1 Kings 13, the man of God from Judah. As soon as you leave me, a lion will kill you. Same thing happens in 1 Kings 20. Finally, verse 10. The ransom to the Lord will return and come with joyful shouting to Zion. With everlasting joy upon their heads, they will find gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Now, again, sounds kind of like a picture of heaven. This verse is quoted later on in Isaiah 51 in verse 11. It's kind of interesting how Isaiah quotes himself. But he brings it back here in verse 11. The ransom to the Lord will return and come with joyful shouting to Zion, and everlasting joy will be on their heads. They will obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. And the two verses are almost exactly the same. What you had in chapter 28, you had the proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim. Here you have crowns of joy in Isaiah 35 for the people of God. The joy in 35:10 kind of bookends the joy in 35:2. But in Isaiah 51, it's a reminder of what God has done in the past. He brought His people back before. He had previously slain the sea monster. He previously made a highway out of the sea. Here, the Babylonian captivity, comes up. And, we're, in Isaiah 51, the Babylonian captivity is what's largely under discussion. Here we are, we're stuck once again. It's like Egypt all over again. And God says, no, I'm bringing you out of Egypt. I'll give you a second Exodus. But Isaiah's picture is even bigger than that, and more idealistic than that. Because what are we really in slavery to? We're not in slavery just to Egypt or Babylon. Our real slavery is to sin. And so the highway that God creates is not simply an exodus to get us out of the land of Egypt or to get us out of a Babylonian captivity. It's an exodus to get us out of the most single corrupting thing that has been at work since the beginning. And that is the problem of sin. God creates a highway to bring us out of sin and to Himself. And, there's all manner, there's any number of sermons we could probably pull out of that and talk about all day. But that's kind of how Isaiah uses this image in Isaiah 35. That's all I have up to the end of chapter 35. Any comments or questions before we close out? All right, well, I guess we'll call it a class. There was a lot of good discussion this time. Enjoyed it.